Europe.
Hey everybody, welcome to Pick Dr. Osborne's Brain. Lovely to have you back tonight on another great Monday night. We're going to have a great show to you all about the thyroid and iodine. Tonight is the ultimate crash course on iodine. We're going to dive deep into thyroid hormone function because it relates. So before we get started tonight, let's just do a quick poll. First of all, tell me hello. Let me know where you're tuning in from in the world. And if you have struggled with a thyroid diagnosis, if you've been ever diagnosed with hypothyroidism or low thyroid or Hashimoto's, just go ahead and type in yes thyroid disease or yes hypothyroid. I'd like to know who I'm talking to tonight and what you're struggling with. Also, make sure that you get your questions queued in for me. I'm going to do my best to get to as many as we can tonight, like I always do, but oftentimes we run out of time. So if you want your question answered, get those questions chimed in and start asking them right away before we get going. So let's dive into the topic of tonight's episode. Let's see here. There we go. We're talking all about iodine. Now, iodine is an essential mineral. Essential meaning that your body cannot function without it. There are about 40 essential nutrients that our body needs, and iodine is one of them. Now, the reason I say essential is very important because a lot of people, I can't tell you how many times I've heard this, a lot of people think they're allergic to iodine. You cannot be allergic to iodine. You can have a bad reaction to a drug or a preparation of iodine. You can have a bad reaction to radioactive iodine, but you cannot actually be allergic to iodine. This is not something that can happen. Iodine is essential. If you were allergic to it, you would die. You would actually never have made it to adulthood to be able to communicate because iodine deficiency very early on in fetuses and then again in young, very young children, infants, leads to a condition called cretinism or mental retardation. And so you can actually die as a result of not having adequate iodine. It's essential, and you cannot be allergic to it. Now, you may have reacted to an iodine test in the hospital where they gave you some radioactive iodine. You may have reacted to the preparation where there may have been some other ingredients in the iodine preparation that possibly you were allergic to, but it's not an allergic response to iodine. It's also not the same thing as a shellfish allergy. A lot of people get that confused. They think that, you know, somehow the iodine is going to give them a reaction because they have a shellfish allergy, and that's just not true. So let's talk about the functions of iodine. The functions of iodine, really, unlike most other nutrients, we don't know as much about iodine, but we do know that iodine functions to produce T4 and T3. These are your thyroid hormones. This is the predominant function of iodine. So T4 and T3. These hormones are important. Why? Because your thyroid hormones regulate growth and metabolism. So imagine your thyroid hormones, when they're properly produced, communicate with your DNA about how your cells are supposed to grow and heal and repair and generate energy. Very, very important processes. So if a mother who is pregnant is deficient in iodine, we can get problems with the infant or with the fetus. If a baby is born and becomes deficient in iodine, we're going to get problems with growth and development, especially in the brain and the nervous system. These are areas, this is why one of the predominant diseases of iodine deficiency is called Cretinism, which is a form of mental retardation, typically shows up in young kids. So again, you've got to have iodine to produce T4 and T3. These are your primary thyroid hormones. Now, T3 is the active form of thyroid hormone. T4 is the inactive form of thyroid hormone, but they are both critically important as it relates to thyroid hormones function. So I'm going to show you a slide. I want to go to another slide because I've got some research for you tonight that I wanted to show you as well. And there's some research that shows the different disorders of iodine deficiency. And so as you can see here, the thyroid function is one of them, but when iodine deficiency is severe, endemic goiter can be one of the symptoms. So the goiter is the enlargement of the thyroid gland itself, and you can get a growth What happens for some people is they actually get a visible, detectable growth that you can see. Some people get a smaller growth or smaller, what's oftentimes referred to as a nodule. And if it's in the right location, it can actually put pressure on the larynx and on the vocal cords and create problems with swallowing. Additionally, we might see, again, cretinism in children or mental retardation. In women and in men, we might see decreased fertility rates. We might see increased death of children being born as a result of iodine deficiency or higher infant mortalities. So all of these different diseases combine together, and we call these IDDs, or iodine deficiency disorders. This is one of the most preventable types of problems in the world. There are about 1 billion people at risk for iodine deficiency disorders. The vast majority of them are in countries or in non-industrialized nations that don't have an iodinization process put in place in their salt. In essence, a lot of industrialized countries added iodine to the salt in order to basically prevent this problem from being an issue. And for example, in the United States in the early 1900s, when goiter was becoming more and more of a problem, this was discovered. A few scientists discovered, Dr. Marine discovered that iodine deficiency was actually a big part of this. And if you fortified the diet with iodine, particularly the salt in this case, that you could prevent the goiters from occurring altogether. Now, that being said, many people in the last 30 to 40 years have gone away from salt. And so we have instead, now we have the government is iodinating salt, but then we have people not eating salt for fear of high blood pressure and cardiovascular disease. And so now a lot of people are showing up as iodine deficient again. So we're seeing more of this. Remember, in the early 1900s, salt was the primary preservative used to preserve pretty much most foods. Today, that's not the case, but we do have iodine in the table salt. So if you're using that table salt to shake onto your food, you're getting some iodine because it's being put there on purpose, and it's been mandated by the government to help to prevent this problem. That being said, I want to pull another study. If we can pull the one on, not that one, let's go down a little bit further. There we go, on this one. So this is interesting because, again, if we're trying to prevent an iodine deficiency, most people do use table salt, but many don't, right? But this study was done where some researchers pulled different versions of salt off the shelves of the grocery store. They looked at 88 different samples, and what they found is that 47 of 88 samples actually fell below the recommendations for iodine fortification. So if you're relying on table salt to get your iodine, this is just another big important part of this iodine puzzle. If you're relying on that table salt, you might not be getting what you think you're getting. Again, almost half, really a little bit more than half of the samples tested in a recent study. This study was published in Environmental Science Technology. Was found that almost half, or actually more than half of the salts that were tested did not contain the adequate quantities of iodine. And so the other thing, here's something else that they found, is that the actual amount of salt even from the same container could vary greatly depending on whether you were at the top of the package or deeper into the bottom of the package, and that varied by as much as 3.3-fold difference in iodine concentration. So again, it's not a perfect process. The iodinization of salt is not a perfect process. So my advice is don't rely strictly on table salt to get your iodine. And many of you are using Himalayan salt. Many of you are using like the sea salts that are really not super high in iodine to any great degree. And so that may pose a problem for you nutritionally in your diet. So let's go to some of the symptoms of iodine deficiency so we can really talk about what it is you might want to look for. Now, goiter is one of the big ones. So if you've ever gone to the doctor, you've been diagnosed with a goiter or thyroid nodules, maybe you had an ultrasound of your thyroid and been told you have nodules. These are symptoms of potential iodine deficiency. Now, I'm going to come back to that in just a minute. Fatigue, brain fog, weight gain, muscle pain. These can also all be symptoms of iodine deficiency as it relates to the thyroid. Remember, if you're not adequately producing these hormones, these are some of the symptoms that can start to creep in and give you problems. Now, another one, I'm going to skip to the bottom of this one, breast tenderness. It's been shown that iodine deficiency can create fibrocystic breast disease and severe breast tenderness in women. And so it's another very common cause, or common symptom related to iodine deficiency. Now you'll see Cretinism and FTT. FTT stands for failure to thrive. This is more so in young toddlers and infants. And so these are some of the hallmark or classic symptoms. We don't typically see these in major industrialized countries, not so much as we do in, say, developing nations where they don't have an iodine program where they're fortifying the salt with iodine. So these are some of your big symptoms of iodine deficiency. Now, that being said, how many of you that have these symptoms and have been to the doctor and been given a diagnosis of low thyroid, have ever been tested for iodine deficiency? So, in my opinion, if you have those symptoms, it's very critical before you just start taking medication that you're tested for iodine deficiency. Now, one of the things that the medications contain, remember, the medications, the preparations are T4, T3 preparations. By default, they have iodine in them. The 4 and the 3 represent how many molecules of iodine. So when you see T4, the 4 is how many molecules of iodine are in that hormone. Same thing with T3. T3 has 3 iodine, T4 has 4 iodine. So if you're taking preparations of medications, you're actually getting some iodine from the medication. So then the question becomes, are you actually benefiting from the iodine, or are you actually benefiting from the thyroid hormone supplementation? My advice to you is if you have been diagnosed with hypothyroidism, you get tested for iodine deficiency before you go on this kind of lifelong trajectory of taking a medication for the rest of your life without actually knowing why you have an or a hypothyroid condition in the first place. Remember, most doctors in the United States, particularly most industrialized countries, do not train in nutrition. The average in the US is less than 7 hours of nutritional training. Iodine is not one of those nutrients. It's very well studied in mainstream medicine. And I have yet to see in 20 years of practice a single person come into my office with a pre-existing hypothyroid diagnosis who'd actually had their iodine levels checked, whether it be by a urine output test or whether it be by a serum test. We'll talk more about those in just a minute. But haven't seen it happen, not by a mainstream medical practitioner, not in 20 years of practice. And so to me, it's almost a travesty. How many women could be saved? How many men could be saved from having lifelong medication if they would just know whether or not they need to fortify their diet or shore up their diet a little bit with iodine? So very, very important that you understand that what iodine does is it supplies a major constituent of T3 and T4. Again, these two combined, okay, that's what iodine is. It's the 4 and it's the 3. So if you've never heard that, if you've gone to the doctor and you've done the testing for thyroid and they've run your TSH and they've run your T4 and they've run your T3, here's a common scenario in people with low thyroid is the TSH is increased, T4 is decreased, and T3 might be decreased. So this is kind of your common scenario in a lab test to confirm a hypothyroid diagnosis. Remember, one of the main reasons why TSH will be elevated is iodine deficiency. One of the main reasons why T4 would be low is iodine deficiency. Same thing with T3, iodine deficiency. Now, there are other nutrients at play not that one. Let's erase that. Let me get the other nutrients at play here. The TSH stands for thyroid stimulating hormone. And this is a hormone produced by your brain. And what it does is it travels to your thyroid gland and it tells your thyroid gland to produce T4. So here's your thyroid gland here. Okay, TSH stimulates the thyroid gland to produce T4. And in doing that, what it actually does is it tells the thyroid gland to trap more iodine from the diet. So from the food that you're eating, the thyroid gland itself will start trapping iodine to produce that T3 and that T4. Once T4 is produced, it's got to be converted to T3. Remember I said earlier that T4 is inactive and T3 is active. So it's T3 that actually communicates to your DNA. Okay, so T3 comes in and it attaches to something called a nuclear receptor, and it activates your DNA to upregulate your metabolic function or your metabolism. And this is why thyroid hormone is so important, because of growth and metabolism. Remember, metabolism is the sum of all chemical reactions in your body. So that's whether you're building new tissue or whether you're breaking old and damaged tissue down so that you can replace it with new tissue. That's metabolism, and that requires proper thyroid hormone function. So we need that iodine because the 4, the 3, both are iodine inclusive. Now, to convert that T4 to T3 requires selenium. So this is another error that I see a lot, is doctors don't ever check selenium levels. To produce that T here in the thyroid hormone, the T is actually tyrosine. So if we say, what is that T? That T is tyrosine. That's an amino acid. And so many people that don't get adequate protein in their diet, have protein malnourishment, don't get adequate tyrosine, can struggle with adequate production of thyroid hormone as a result of tyrosine deficiency, selenium deficiency, iodine deficiency. And one of the other things that has to happen, since we're on the topic, is in order for your thyroid gland to properly trap iodine, that requires vitamin C and it requires vitamin B2. And so without those two nutrients, that doesn't happen very well. So you've got this kind of orchestration of different nutrients that work kind of synergistically with each other. Just like in the orchestra, you got violins, you've got cellos, you've got big drums. They all sound beautiful when they play together. Well, it's the same thing here. Your thyroid can work beautifully if all these nutrients are playing together. But if you don't have adequate iodine, and you've been diagnosed with hypothyroidism and your doctor did not test you for iodine deficiency, you need to go back and ask them to run that test. Additionally, it might not be a bad idea to ask them to run tests for tyrosine, selenium, vitamin B2, and vitamin C as well, to just confirm that you don't have other nutrient deficits that are playing a role in this problem. So let's talk next about what other things in the research. I want to go back up. There's a slide. There's a research slide I want to show on. Let's see here, the next one right here. So this is a new study that's just recently come out. You can see the date of this study. It was published in Redox Biology in 2019. So we're talking about just a couple months ago. This study came out in September. And what they're showing in this research study is that, aside from the fact, what I've got highlighted here is iodine or iodide ions are an essential dietary mineral and crucial for mental and physical development, fertility, and thyroid function. Iodine is also a high affinity substrate for the heme enzyme myeloperoxidase. Let's make sense of that for just a minute. Myeloperoxidase is an enzyme that the immune system uses to kill bad bacteria and to have an effective immune response. So the byproduct of myeloperoxidase reacting would be an inflammatory process. Now, one of the things that activates myeloperoxidase as an enzyme is high levels of hydrogen peroxide in a substance known as chlorine. Now, you've probably heard of chlorine before, or chloride. It's what's found in most of your drinking water. So if you're not filtering your drinking water and you're getting exposure to excessive chloride, it's actually been shown to trigger this MPO enzyme to create more of a reaction, which the byproduct of this reaction is to trigger inflammation. And so what iodine does is it calms this system down, and not having adequate iodine and too much chlorine can actually trigger a greater degree of inflammation. And so what this study is showing is that the newer research coming out thinks that an iodine deficiency is in a big way linked to cardiovascular disease as a result of an inflammatory process. So that's something that's coming out that's relatively new in the research. But we've got some other things that we know in both the research as well that iodine is also important for. And I mentioned this earlier, the fibrocystic breast disease. So if you have tender breasts or you have non-cancerous fibrocystic issues, this might very well be an iodine deficiency. Now, the mechanism of action to date is not understood fully. In essence, we don't know why that correlation is, but there have been a number of research studies that show that iodine supplementation for women with fibrocystic breast disease leads to dramatic reduction of cystic tissue formation, but also leads to a delineation or an elimination for many women of the fibrocystic breast pain. So iodine, very, very important in regulating breast tissue as well. Let's go to some of the, let's scroll down. I want to talk next about what causes iodine deficiency. So for most people, the cause of iodine deficiency has to do with poor diet. We really look at the food sources of iodine, and so poor diet, what does that really mean? Poor diet means not getting adequate foods that contain iodine. So, okay, highly processed foods. Now, you may be getting highly processed foods and saying, well, I'm getting the salt in those highly processed foods. But if you recall, I just showed you a research study that delineated that more than half of the salts tested didn't actually have the iodine that they should have had, according to the government. So you can't really rely on that. Plus, processed food and poor diet is a bad idea in general anyway for all of your nutrients. Iodine depleted soils are another issue. The depleted soils, this is not one you're not just gonna go sprinkle some iodine, in your garden. Not really. Depleted soils have to do with glaciation, so the way glaciers are formed, the way water runoff can deplete the topsoil of iodine, or the iodine in the topsoil, how it can wash it away. And so this is one of those issues where soils are not very vastly rich. Now, there are some soils that are richer than others, and a lot of these soils are in river valley type areas. So geographically speaking, river valleys generally tend to have a higher iodine concentration in the soil. So crops that are grown in those areas would tend to, take up that iodine, and so potentially show up on your dinner plate. Problem is that most farming today is done in soils that don't get replenishment. I mean, the greatest degree of replenishment for most soils is manure spreading. And so, the animal manure, if the animal's getting adequate grazing with adequate iodine, then the manure is going to contain some iodine as well. And so when that manure is spread out and cast out over the field, that you're going to get some iodine concentration back into the soil. But most farmers today don't use a ton of manure. Now, that's not all, but many of them don't. Many of them use nitrogen fixation in the form of rotating crops, or in the form of chemical nitrogen fertilizers. And nitrogen is akin to taking steroids, right? So the big gym rats take the steroids and their muscles get really big, but their livers and their internal health is destroyed. Well, it's the same thing with using high levels of nitrogen-based fertilizers on fruits and vegetables. The fruits grow big and look good, but they're not very rich in nutrient density internally. And so that includes their ability to incorporate nutrients from the soil. But if the soil's already depleted, you can see where that would pose an even greater degree of problem. Another issue is excessive goitrogen exposure. We'll talk about goitrogens in just a minute, so I'm going to pause there and I'll show you what those are in just a minute. But next I want to talk about halides. Halides, excessive halide exposure. Halides don't necessarily cause iodine deficiency, but halides compete with iodine for uptake into the thyroid gland. So what are halides? Halides, well, I mentioned chlorine earlier, but we've also got fluoride and then bromine. So these three compounds, chlorine, fluoride, bromine, commonly found in our environments today, actually are all classified in that halogen group or that halide group. Now, iodine is also a halide, right? So iodine's part of that group. So these four things compete with each other for uptake into your thyroid gland. Now, what happens, people get overexposed to these things. Where do we get those chlorines? We get them, a lot of people get it from not filtering their water, or drinking water that's chlorinated, or being exposed to high levels of chlorine. We get fluoride in things like toothpaste and mouthwash, in the dental chair, and fluoridated water as well, depending on where you live, if there's a fluoridated water process. And then bromine Bromine is found in the water as well. It's used as an antiseptic in the water. It's used to kill bacteria. It's also used as a flame retardant. So bromine can be sprayed on mattresses, on clothing, and it can be sprayed on other things that we're trying to prevent from catching fire on a general basis. So think of carpets or wood flooring, things of that nature. Bromines are also used as pesticides, as are chlorines. We've got a family of chemical pesticides that are used called organochlorines and organobromines. These can also be used in high quantities. We can see them in things like pesticides. If you have a pest guy come and spray your house. And then additionally, fluoride, another source of fluoride exposure that I see very commonly is in tea. So if you're a big tea drinker, if you love to drink tea, particularly your black tea, like your black pekoe tea, if you consume 2, 3, 4, 5 cups a day, like the massive quantities, you could be getting excessive fluoride. I've actually seen some cases of fluoride toxicity in heavy tea drinkers. So if you're getting exposure to all three, know, especially if your iodine levels are already kind of borderline or iffy, then now it's going to spark a bigger problem here. And again, that iodine deficiency generally can trend toward hypothyroidism, but halide toxicity can also trend toward hypothyroidism. So the same symptoms of iodine deficiency can be caused by halide toxicity. And I thought it was worth mentioning because many of you are being exposed to those things on a regular basis. Okay, next let's talk a little bit about goitrogens. I promised you that I would come back to goitrogens and talk a little bit more about these. Now, a few of these I want you to pay really close attention to. Goitrogens are substances that can inhibit thyroid hormone formation, and not all of them have to do with the thyroid, or rather with iodine per se, but cassava can. And the reason I want you to pay close attention to this one is because cassava is a major food alternative right now. And if you're following me for any length of time and you've read No Grain, No Pain, my book, and you've tried to follow a true gluten-free diet, a lot of you have gravitated toward things like cassava flour as a flour substitute. Now, that's all fine and good, but if you're doing it in mass, okay, if you're doing large quantities of cassava, and a lot of people did this originally with almonds, like almond flour everything, right? Well, cassava flour everything is now becoming more and more popular. Cassava contains a substance called thiocyanate, and this can inhibit iodine uptake into your thyroid. It can actually create a problem with being able to produce thyroid hormone. So if you're exposed or exposing yourself to large quantities of cassava, be careful. I wouldn't make it a staple food in your diet. There are cultures where cassava comes from different cultures. Some cultures in Africa use high levels of cassava, and the reason why we know this is because goiter was such a problem in these cultures. So again, cassava can inhibit iodine uptake into the thyroid because of the chemical thiocyanate. Now, tobacco can as well. So those of you, hopefully none of you listening to this show are still smoking, but there are a number of people that continue to smoke. And the cyanide in cigarette smoke can form thiocyanate, and that can also inhibit iodine uptake into the thyroid. So we don't like to see pregnant women smoking, or for that matter, anyone smoking. And one of the reasons why has to do with, with this connection between your iodine uptake. So tobacco, you want to keep it out for sure. Now, we also have other goitrogens that are commonly talked about, and those are your cruciferous vegetables. I've seen people panic over this one because, broccoli, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, these are examples, cabbage, these are examples of cruciferous vegetables. Now, unless you're just juicing massive quantities of these vegetables, you're probably not going to create a goitrogenic effect and create a goiter in your thyroid. However, that being said, if you are a heavy juicer, if you're a heavy vegan and you are using massive quantities of these cruciferous vegetables and you're struggling with brain fog and fatigue and thyroid nodules, you might want to look at your diet and manipulate it a little bit away from those goitrogenic types of vegetables. So again, that's your cruciferous vegetables. Now we've also got soy. Soy is another one. And it's more specifically, there are compounds in soy that inhibit thyroid hormone synthesis. So some of your components to soy that, you know, a lot of you may be using soy in mass. I see it again, sometimes, not to pick on vegetarians or vegans, but this is where I'll see these two problems crop up when I see them, is in the cruciferous group. The people who use a ton of soy and soy-based products and a ton of cruciferous vegetables simultaneously. And we'll see a lot of them start to become very lethargic. Many of them will develop nodules or goiters, basically, in their thyroid gland as a result of consuming high amounts of these particular types of foods. So again, I want to be very clear. It doesn't mean you can never eat broccoli, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, or cabbage. It's not what a goitrogen means. And generally, when you cook them really, really well, cook them down really, really well, a lot of the components that are goitrogenic in the cruciferous family are neutralized as a result of cooking them. So that's another avenue. Don't eat them raw. A lot of, you know, there's a big movement for raw vegetarianism, and, you know, this is one of the problems that you might come into. It doesn't mean you can't eat them. It just means if you have a hypothyroid situation and you haven't been properly diagnosed and you're not sure whether or not you're eating too many, like, you might want to look at that and consider cutting them out. Now, that being said, we talked about the foods that are goitrogenic. Let's talk about the foods that are rich in iodine. Some of the things that you can consume that are going to be rich in iodine. Now, the big one here on this list, foods high in iodine, is seafood. If it comes out of the ocean, it's going to have more iodine in it. So seaweed is the richest substance we know of as far as iodine is concerned. Seaweed by far outranks everything on this list astronomically. But we can also get iodine from other seafood. So think fish, shrimp, that type of thing. There's a large quantity of iodine available in seafood. Now, if you're catching fish from a freshwater lake or freshwater river, you're not so much going to get the level of iodine that you're going to get, because remember, with the quantity of salt and iodine in the ocean, that's where it is taken up by the animals and by the plant and vegetation within the ocean. So if you're eating that ocean vegetation, if you're eating lots of rich saltwater-based fish, you're going to get lots of iodine. As a matter of fact, some of the cultures in Japan have levels of iodine hundreds of times higher than what we might see here, and thrive and do very, very well and have very, very little to no incidence of goiters or thyroid issues. Milk can also be a good source of iodine, provided your animals are grazing on iodine-rich soils. Now, I said earlier that some soils are richer than others in terms of iodine. And so interestingly enough, Texas is one of the areas with the richest iodine in the soil. Other parts of the U.S., not so great. So maybe one more reason to move to Texas, wink, wink. Eggs also have a little bit of iodine. Potato has some iodine as well. So you can get some iodine from some other foods. Now, another source of iodine, if you're on a well and your well is drilled deep enough, a lot of the iodine is not, again, it's not on that top soil surface layer, but it can be deeper in the ground. So if your well's deep enough, there might be a substantial source of iodine coming through your well water in your diet as well. So foods on iodine, think of anything that comes out of the ocean. You know, some people ask, do you use iodinated salt? Is that something that I recommend? Not so much. I really recommend getting it from your food. If you don't like seafood, I recommend more a multivitamin, a pharmaceutical controlled regulated multivitamin where you can guarantee you're going to get the dose. The reason why the studies on salt show such a disparaging difference, you may think you're getting adequate salt iodine, but the reality is the research shows that you might not be. So a good multivitamin, something like Ultra Nutrients that contains iodine, it's actually one of the reasons why I formulated it with iodine. A lot of people are scared to take iodine because they've been told that iodine destroys or causes hyperthyroidism, and that's very, very rare, and it doesn't really cause hyperthyroidism. It can create symptoms that feel like hyperthyroidism, but those go away the moment or within weeks of removing the iodine. So it's not really a huge mega risk for people. It's probably one of those things that's been overblown in the internet and the blogosphere. So again, seaweed, okay. If you're lucky enough to have a well that has iodine in it, that's great. But unless you're measuring that, don't rely on it. Additionally, milk. I mentioned milk, but A2. A2 milk instead of A1 milk. A1 milk produces A1 cows produce a casein that can mimic gluten. So if you're trying to follow a gluten-free diet, A1 milk's a bad idea. But A2 milk, there's some research that shows that that's not going to create that same kind of cross-reactivity that we might see with a gluten cross-reactivity. The problem with A2 milk is it's very hard to find unless you find it highly processed and highly pasteurized, unless you own your own cows and milk your own cows. So not that easy to get a hold of. And then again, beyond that, egg, potato are also good sources. Chicken meat is actually a pretty decent source of iodine as well. So let's talk a little bit about iodine toxicity, because I was talking about some people questioning whether or not iodine is safe if you have an autoimmune thyroid problem. This is probably one of the most common questions that I get asked, and the answer is yes. Iodine is safe, but it's a dose issue. You can go way too high with iodine. Is there a toxicity level that we could reach with iodine? And the answer is there's a toxicity level to everything, but there's not a lot of research on iodine toxicity. There are acute iodine toxicities, and if you generally speaking, to get acute iodine toxicity, you've got to be taking grams a day. We're not talking about the stuff that's in your typical supplements. So acute toxicity of iodine is generally going to manifest as burning the mouth, burning of the throat, burning in the stomach. These are all things that can happen. So we'll just put burning up here. People can develop fever, cyanosis. The skin can turn a bluish discoloration. Again, iodine is purple in color, and it's a pigment. It can pigment. If you've ever seen, in a surgery room where they rub that iodine gel on the skin to prep people for surgery, because iodine is a natural antibacterial, so it helps to prevent infection. But that stuff can absorb into you, and it does dye you. So the cyanosis of the skin, that you got to be really, really high levels to get to that. And then as well, like vomiting or nausea, because you've ingested such a high quantity, just too much at one time. Again, that's an acute toxicity. But as far as chronic toxicity, there's no great research showing that chronic toxicities exist. As a matter of fact, I mentioned earlier that some cultures in Japan eat the level of iodine, anywhere from 50 to 80 milligrams a day or more of iodine with no signs or symptoms of toxicity or hyperthyroidism as a result or as a cause of that consumption. So it's a case-by-case basis. If you have an autoimmune thyroid disease, you should not be scared of taking iodine, but you also just shouldn't take a ton of megadose iodine without actually testing your levels. So let's talk next about iodine testing. We're running out of room here. Now we can put it right here. So testing, how do you know whether or not you have an iodine deficiency? Now, I've seen some people come in to see me and they had some plasma iodine levels done. You can test it in the blood, but it's not a very accurate assessment or in a very accurate way to actually identify whether or not a person has a need for iodine. So blood is kind of, we'll put question mark by it. It can be tested, but blood plasma, but not recommended, not the kind of gold standard, okay? Some people actually do a skin test where you put a solution of iodine on the skin, and then if it absorbs quick enough, then they call that an iodine deficiency. Although this, it can be marginally helpful. It's not something I would recommend that you do long-term iodine supplementation based on. And then the last, and in my opinion, the most important is the loading test. It's called an iodine loading test. Now, one of the things that I like to do when I'm running an iodine loading test is I like to look at all the halides together. And that way you don't just get an idea for iodine and how much iodine is or isn't there, but you also get an idea for whether or not this person is being exposed to things that would contribute to interference with the uptake of iodine into the thyroid gland itself. So a loading test is generally done. This is a urine test. And it's generally done by taking a first morning sample of urine followed by a 50 milligram dose of iodine iodide, and then a collection of urine over the next 24 hours. And what's being looked at there is how much of the 50 milligrams of iodine, because 50 milligrams is a really strong dose, how much of that came out in the urine over a 24-hour period. An average person with adequate iodine is going to excrete 80 to 90% of that 50 milligrams out into the urine, and that would indicate decent saturation of iodine in their tissues. So it's a much better indicator for whether or not a person is tissue saturated with iodine. And it's a functional outcomes-based parameter type test, which makes it more effective and more accurate when you're trying to ascertain whether or not you should be taking higher doses of iodine, especially over long periods of time. It's not something I recommend people do without having adequate testing, at least not higher doses. So that brings us to the next one, which is kind of what are the doses? What are the doses of iodine if we're looking at how much to take? It's recommended that about 200 micrograms a day for an average person is what's necessary to prevent iodine-induced disease. Again, you got to remember that these smaller numbers are so that you make sure there's not a frank, overt hypothyroidism goiter happening. But with deficiencies, there's kind of what we look at as the recommended daily allowance or the recommended daily intake versus the optimal level versus suboptimal versus subclinical disease. Like there's a kind of a category or a range of levels. And so 200 micrograms is just a recommended daily amount to avoid frank overt disease. So this number, it might be higher for some than that. It might be higher for some. And so 200 micrograms is kind of just a baseline to think about. So a good multivitamin is going to contain adequate quantities of iron in that way. Again, part of why I formulated Ultra Nutrients with iodine was to make sure that if you weren't using salt and you were avoiding that processed food and that processed salt, and you didn't like seafood, because I don't like seafood, not very much anyway, that you could get adequate iodine without having to worry about using highly chemically washed table salt as part of your regular diet. Now, therapeutically, how much iodine? So there's a much bigger range of therapeutic levels of iodine. And so that ranges for most anywhere between 5 and really up to 50 milligrams a day. Now, I don't recommend that anybody go into that high level 50, even really 25 milligrams or higher without really having your level tested, because if you haven't had your level tested, you may not need that much. And again, it's not that iodine is dangerous to supplement with. However, you don't want to, one of the things with iodine, one of the reasons why I don't like to see people supplement, especially if they have a thyroid problem, is because taking higher levels, like 25 milligrams of iodine or higher, can actually falsely elevate your TSH. And so what happens is you're taking iodine and your TSH shoots up. Normal TSH is going to be, depending on the lab, it's going to be anywhere from like 0.2 to 4.5. Like that's the normal range for TSH. But when you take iodine in higher doses, I've seen cases where it'll drive it up over 25. And so if you're driving up your TSH over 25 and you end up in your doctor's office, and he's measuring your TSH or she's measuring your TSH and you're at 25, they're going to freak out and try to put you on mega doses of thyroid hormone. So again, not a good idea to just, take it surreptitiously in high mega doses without having adequate testing done. But relatively safe at, if you keep it 12.5 milligrams or less, if you're doing this on your own without the oversight of a doctor, that's relatively safe. But again, I wouldn't do it longer than a year if you're not getting tested, but relatively safe. So that's kind of your issue on the doses. So I think we've covered everything we could cover for the most part about iodine. I'm going to open the floor for any questions that we've got coming in. Okay. How many of you? Yeah, a lot of you chiming in with thyroid issues. Let's see here. If you had half the thyroid removed for a nodule, is it necessary to take thyroid for the rest of your life? Told necessary to suppress the thyroid. Well, if you had half your thyroid removed, Didi, there are a number of reasons, and I'm not sure because you didn't give me enough detail, but some people get half their thyroid removed because of a goiter or because of a cancer, some because they have hyperthyroid, and so they opted to have half their thyroid removed. It depends on why it was removed, but is it necessary to take it the rest of your life? I've seen it go both ways. I've actually seen people not need to take the thyroid medication, even with just half a thyroid, if they got their diet and their lifestyle dialed in. It's kind of like, well, kind of like a kidney. If you have a kidney removed, the other kidney gets a little bit bigger and takes on the work of two kidneys, then your body adapts and moves on. And so kind of I've seen the same thing with the thyroid, but it just depends on why you had half of it removed. Let's see. Cystic fibrosis and iodine. James wants to know my thoughts on cystic fibrosis and iodine. My thoughts on any nutrient, doesn't matter what disease we're talking about, including cystic fibrosis, is test, don't guess. I mean, I could boil it down to that and probably be the simplest way to say it, because I've seen cases of cystic fibrosis. I've seen cases of cardiovascular disease. I've seen cases of hypothyroidism. I've seen cases of multiple forms of autoimmune disease. And if I were just to generically give everybody the same thing, I could be way off the mark for most of them. But testing affords and allows us to get very, very specific about whether or not a person needs that and whether or not that's going to help that person's overall recovery and function. Julie says, please elaborate on cause of thyroid nodules. I'm in the watch and see mode. Well, I mean, look, the biggest cause of thyroid nodules historically is iodine deficiency, Julie. So have your doctor do an iodine loading test. As far as other causes, gluten is a major cause. If you haven't read No Grain, No Pain, pick up a copy of No Grain, No Pain and get to reading and get to applying phase 1 and phase 2 of the diet, because that's probably arguably the largest cause of what we see in epidemic hypothyroid problems nowadays. Other things can cause it as well. There certainly are a number of chemicals. We mentioned the halides earlier, but even things like rocket propellants and jet fuels and things of that nature. So if you live near an airport, or if you're in a house that's, a mile away from the airport and you've got all that jet stream fuel just dumping down in your house all the time, like that's one of those areas where you might have some serious water and air filtration that you want to implement or even potentially move. Burgle says, hi from my mom's basement. Welcome, Burgle. Rosemary, can a lack of iodine cause a miscarriage? Fetus never developed, a miscarried at 2 months. I was undiagnosed hypo at the time and previously had 2 children 2 years before. Yes, it can. As a matter of fact, I love that question, Rosemary. One of the cases that came in to see me is a woman who had such severe levels of fluoride toxicity. Her level when we actually got her water testing back, it was severe. She actually had a blue ring around her bathtub. There was so much fluoride in her drinking water, and it was actually causing her to have an infertility issue. Until when we figured that out, we actually pushed that fluoride toxicity out of her using more iodine. That's one of the ways to detoxify from halide toxicity, is to use iodine as kind of an antidote, so to speak. There's actually, when they study, if you guys recall the Chernobyl incident in Russia, where the nuclear power plant basically was breached, it was the widespread use of iodine that inhibited the radioactivity levels to create the children of that generation. A lot of times where you see radioactive spills and things, is the children end up with a lot of cancer. Well, in this case, iodine was used, and so we think that's the reason why it prevented the vast increase in cancers from children born of the parents that were exposed at Chernobyl. Let's see here. What are the defining symptoms of iodine deficiency? My doctor says I can't be deficient. It only happens in third. Your doctor's, well, I'm just going to be frank. Your doctor's a moron. If he says that you can't be iodine deficient and it's only going to happen in third world countries, then he's not a very intelligent doctor, and you might need to go find a new one. And I don't really like to talk bad about other people, but that's just ignorance talking, and I don't like that. I don't like it when people are told such nonsense. Get tested. The defining symptoms of iodine deficiency can be many different things, as we said already. You might just have hypothyroidism, and if you already know you have that and you haven't been tested, it's the very first thing you need to ask for. Anne says, I have nodules and I'm hyperthyroid. I have learned to keep away from excess iodine. Is that correct? Yes and no, because there is actually some research, and I've seen this be the case, where hyperthyroid can actually be caused by iodine deficiency too. But as a general rule of thumb, yes, you don't want to take high doses of iodine if you're hyperthyroid, but you do want to have a number of other things checked. One of the biggest correlations with hyperthyroid Graves' disease is gluten sensitivity. Just like gluten can cause Hashimoto's, gluten can also cause Graves, among other things. Other chemicals. Graves is in my experience, is really, I see a lot of people with Graves' disease who have a lot of chemical reactivity. And when we start addressing that chemical reactivity, we see improvements. How does this affect, Diana wants to know, how does this affect people who have had their thyroid removed, a total thyroidectomy? Well, if you've had your total thyroid removed and there's no residual tissue left and there's no functioning thyroid left whatsoever, then you're probably just going to be good to go with your thyroid medication. It's not the best solution, but you can't undo the surgery once it's happened. And that's just the nature of the beast. So you can't relive the past. You can't stay in the past. You just got to move on. But if you've had a total thyroidectomy, you're probably going to be on that medication, for the rest of your life. Let's see here. Dr. Osborne, can you do some vids about Lyme virus mold remedies and healthy ways to gain weight when battling? Yeah, I can. We'll come back and do that in 2020. Okay. What about being hyper and steering clear of iodine because it stimulates excess thyroid hormone? Again, iodine doesn't stimulate excessive thyroid hormone. How do we know this? We know this from the Japanese cultures who consume in their diets through seaweed and seafood on the order of magnitude of 50 to 80 milligrams of iodine a day without an increased incidence of hyperthyroid. So again, I think it's just my experience and my opinion that whole hyperthyroid and iodine connection has been overblown and overbloated. And I just don't see that pan out. That being said, it's never a good idea to just megadose any nutrient without adequate guidance. Let's see here. My doctor won't test me for iodine deficiency. I already asked him. Well, find a new doctor, Wanda. If your doctor's not willing to be objective and he just wants to spout rhetoric that doesn't have any scientific or objective basis, it's probably time to move on. That sounds to me like not a very good doctor. Let's see. No functioning doctor, and T4 was fine, so they don't test T3, so I started taking 12 milligrams of iodine 2 months ago. Yeah, you could do that. So they should be testing TSH, T3, T4, reverse T3, free T3, and free T4 as a baseline for thyroid hormone testing. Then you should also ask them to test the full spectrum of nutrients related to thyroid formation or thyroid hormone formation. And we did a number of months ago an entire video on the intrinsic detailed nature of the nutrients required to make thyroid, but also to activate and to connect thyroid to your DNA. So if you aren't familiar with that, there's about 17 different nutrients that are required for your thyroid to properly be produced and to be activated. Dwayne says, I take kelp tablets for my iodine. Is that sufficient? It might be, Dwayne. It depends on the level of iodine in those kelp tablets and the size of tablets that you're taking. Let's see. You wants to know, could iodine deficiency be the cause of legs, foot, and hand cramps? Yes, it can, but that's generally leg, foot, and hand cramps are generally excessive caffeine, too much too much diuretic medication. So if you're on like a blood pressure medication that's a diuretic, that can do that. And then not enough calcium, magnesium, potassium, or electrolyte imbalance. Those are kind of more common to see cramping like that. Let's see, Shireen, I'm hypertensive. I use sea salt. Am I not using the right salt? It's not an issue of whether or not you're using the wrong or right salt. It's an issue, Shireen, of whether or not you're getting enough iodine in the diet that you eat. So again, don't rely on sea salt as the only source of iodine in your diet. You should really be relying heavily on the seafood. If you don't like seafood, you should be looking at supplementing your diet with some type of really quality multivitamin, again, that contains iodine. I have an iodine preparation, but the dose starts at 12.5 milligrams. So, you know, if we're looking at, again here, 12.1 pill is 12.5 milligrams. I have something called ultra iodine, but I also have something called ultra nutrients, and ultra nutrients contains your daily need for iodine, not in a mega dose, but in a regular kind of closer to this range here, and just making sure you're getting adequate quantities. Let's see. Elizabeth says, I understand bromine replaced iodine in breads. It did. So brominated wheat flour is one of the things that, you know, bromine is added as a dough conditioner. And so it's, you'll see that a lot. If you know, again, if you're eating wheat and you're watching me, you may want to go back and read No Grain, No Pain, and you'll change your mind on that wheat. But brominated wheat, definitely a source of bromine. Let's see. Recently read that the West Coast is being fried by the nuclear radiation from Fukushima. Should we increase iodine to protect? And two, should seafood be eaten? This is a really good question, Elizabeth, and I don't think anybody can truly fully answer it and know for certain. I would say yes, it wouldn't be a bad idea to protect yourself with a little bit higher levels of iodine, somewhere in this neighborhood, more of this kind of counter-effective dose of 12.5 a day if you are, you know, in that area. But there have been some studies that show that the nuclear fallout, so to speak, in the ocean water is greater in your area, but even worse around Japan. Let's see, what causes thyroid nodules and what to do after diagnosis? Again, a lot of things cause thyroid nodules. Gluten can cause them. Chemical reactions can cause them. Nutritional deficiency, including iodine deficiency, can cause them. Selenium deficiency can cause thyroid nodules. So a number of different things. Again, the key, many of you have gone to your doctor and you've been told you have thyroid nodules or hypothyroidism. And so then you've been put on a medication. And what you've been told is what I've heard, you know, client after client come in and see me say, which is, my doctor said I had hypothyroidism and I needed to take this medicine for the rest of my life. But the only test that he ran was TSH, right? Which is like, it's a good test, but it shouldn't be the test that says you need to be on a medication for the rest of your life. So again, you want to get with a doctor who's going to test multiple avenues of how your thyroid works, the nutrients related with your thyroid, the chemical associations with nodular goiter formation. So again, having all of those things looked at is very important if you're going to find out why. Don't just blindly take a medication because your doctor told you that you needed to for the rest of your life. It doesn't make any sense. You know, deal with it by asking intelligent questions and hopefully getting a doctor who's going to spend a little bit more time with you and be a little bit more investigative. Let's see here. Dealing with stress and noticing what triggers my stress, be it people or places, I steer clear of being hyperthyroid. I don't need extra stress. Okay, no question on that. Love it. Ann says iodine makes a huge difference to how she feels. Hair test shows iodine level. No, hair test not a great indicator of iodine, Shasha. So I wouldn't use that as the indicator for whether or not you're adequately getting iodine. Did I ever hear of someone being allergic to bovine thyroid supplement? I developed acne 5 days after starting it, but my doctor doesn't believe it's related. It might be. It's possible. I mean, I get people that react to bovine glandular stuff, you know, it's not super, super common, but it does happen. And if you know, the best key there, Lori, would be to stop it for a couple of weeks if the acne goes away, and then start it again. And if the acne comes back, you'll kind of have an answer, like a more clear-cut answer. Let's see. Have you ever heard of someone losing their ability to feel hunger and thirst? My thyroid tests are fine. However, my paradoxis and my, I think you mean your peroxidase antibodies are consistently high. Any tests I could recommend? Yes, people can lose their ability to feel hunger and thirst, and there are a number of different conditions that can affect that. My advice to you, really, I mean, that's kind of a challenging question in this format, is get with a really solid functional doc to get that one figured out. If you're using chloramine and not chloramine, what you can use to filter it out, the best thing to use is reverse osmosis. If you go check out Gluten-Free Society, we have a shop there, and then we have some lifestyle recommendations on a reverse osmosis product that works fantastically well. Let's see. Dolores wants to know about the cyanide in apricot seeds. I would assume you're taking apricot seeds for a cancer issue, but can the cyanide in that potentially inhibit thyroid function? And the answer is yes, potentially it could. So you kind of got to weigh the balance of that. Let's see, Carol says, I've heard so much that iodine is bad for Hashimoto's and I've been avoiding for years, never resolved Hashi, even with your diet and fasting. I have been consuming a full nori sheet once a week for the past few months, and I feel the same, although not completed antibody labs. What are your thoughts on iodine for Hashi? I'm fine with iodine for Hashi. You just need to get a full workup, Carol. If you're following no grain, no pain, and you didn't put your antibodies to sleep or to bed, it's because you're missing something else. Remember, there's 4 primary triggers for antibodies to the thyroid. There's chemical triggers, food triggers, nutritional deficiency triggers, and microbial triggers. Microbial meaning bacteria, yeast, parasitic, etc. So if you haven't had all those things looked at, you're probably missing one of those other 4 triggers or multiple triggers, not just gluten or grain. Let's see, Betty, is iodized salt healthy, or is it better to get iodine from other sources? My opinion, it's better to get it from other sources, but if you had no other option, iodized salt would be, again, we got to get iodine in the diet. So generally I'd say get it from other sources, but if you were, if you had no other option, you could use iodized salt. It's just, there are better options. Let's see here. Keep going. Yeah, if your doc refuses to check for anything other than TSH, again, they're working in antiquated dark ages of endocrinology. If that's the case, it's time to move in with you might want to consider a different doctor if that's all they're testing. Yeah, so Linda says, iodine was never even brought up in the conversation when I was diagnosed with hypothyroidism 10 years ago. Yeah, it is infuriating. That's why I'm doing this show, because how many people suffer with hypothyroidism? I mean, it's the #1 prescription medication written in the United States today is for thyroid medicine, or if it's not #1, it kind of fluctuates between like #1 and #5. So it's because, doctors rely on pills to solve people's problems, and people let them. So, those of you who are listening to the show, the ball's in your court now. Don't let your doctor solve your problem with some pills. Ask the right questions. That's why we're doing the show, so you know what questions that you can ask. Okay. Are nodules only caused by selenium deficiency? No. Again, nodules can be caused by lots of things. Iodine is one of the big causes. Selenium deficiency can also cause them, but not the only cause. Okay, what lab do you recommend for nutrient testing? Lymphocyte proliferation. So it's a specialized type of test that looks inside the lymphocyte to measure nutritional status based on the cellular functional outcome or growth of your lymphocytes. It's a very advanced type of technology. If you're doing serum lab testing, or you're doing something like oat testing, organic acid tests, it's not those can't be helpful. They're just not as, they're more extrapolative, and they're not a super objective black and white. Yeah, I agree, June. We need regenerative agriculture for sure. Let's see. Is it advisable to supplement with iodine for Hashimoto sufferers with thyroid nodules, or is it? No, it's not. Again, I know I've answered this a number of times, and maybe I'm getting these questions, some of these questions a little bit after I've already answered them, but it's not a contraindication. What's a contraindication is taking 50 milligrams of iodine without ever having measured your iodine levels in an accurate setting, and going it alone. Like that to me would be contraindicated. But getting iodine, you remember iodine's an essential nutrient, and hypothyroidism can be caused by iodine deficiency. So it's not contraindicated in autoimmune hypothyroidism. Organic black tea, yes, it does contain fluoride. It has nothing to do with whether the tea is organic, Wendy. It has more to do with the age of the leaf when the tea is picked. Tea is really good at pulling fluoride out of the soil. And so if you're wanting to drink tea and you like tea and you want to drink a lot of tea, you should look at a brand that picks the tea leaf early. Again, if you go over to visit us at Gluten Free Society, my foundation, there's a shop with food resources, and we've kind of hand selected some of the companies that and tea companies included for these reasons. Let's see, what are iodine cofactors? Refine your question, Chucho. It's kind of esoteric. Let's see, can one live with thyroid nodules forever, or should they go away? They should go away with the correct diet and lifestyle changes, Chris. A2 milk is milk produced by cows with A2 genetics as opposed to A1 genetics. And so the difference being that A1 milk, which is what most milk is in industrialized countries, A1 milk has been linked to and shown to increase the risk for the development of certain autoimmune problems. There's also some research that shows that BCM7, beta-caseomorphin 7, a type of protein found in A1 milk, can act like morphine and create addiction issues and create other problems. It's been linked to type 1 diabetes. So it's just not one that I would recommend that you drink. How should you test iodine in children? The same way you do in adults with an iodine loading test. Let's see. Can iodine drops stain your teeth if you dissolve it in water? They shouldn't stain your teeth. They might stain, if you've got like growth on your teeth, like, tartar buildup. They might stain the tartar itself, but it's not going to actually stain the teeth, or shouldn't. Let's see, Ann. I had one doctor who said my thyroid levels were too high, told me to up my meds, found a functional doc and said they were in the normal range. Was a big shock, and yep, ticked off. Yep, you should have been. Yeah, because if you take too much thyroid medication, the problem with taking too much thyroid medication over time is that it puts more pressure on your heart. And so those of you who are on thyroid medication, if you're experiencing heart palpitations, hot flashes, trouble sleeping, muscle cramping, those are potential signs, agitation, irritability. Those are potential signs that your medicine might be too high. I get people all the time where they're on the medication and their level, their TSH level is like 0.05, which is far lower than you can see this reference range. And that means they're being over medicated typically. And so it's an indicator that you want to have a conversation with your prescribing doctor about potentially lowering the medication to reduce your risk of developing a heart issue. Yeah, dogs are being prescribed levothyroxine nowadays. I mean, even the dogs, they're eating grain too. And that's one of the big problems with thyroid disease is grain is a major contributor to it. What causes a person to not convert T4 to T3? Lack of selenium. There's a series of enzymes called deiodinase enzymes, and those are selenium-driven enzymes. So to convert T4 to T3 requires a deiodinase enzyme that is selenium-driven. So lack of selenium is a big reason why that happens. Okay, I think we pushed way over time tonight, folks. So I've got more questions coming in. I don't think I'm going to be able to get to them all. But thanks for tuning in. As always, help me share the mission. If you enjoy the show, this is a show free of charge. We don't charge anything for it. It's just my brain on your plate every Monday night. But what I ask of you is to help me share the message. Our goal is to reach 100 million lives. We're trying to save 100 million lives. So do me a favor, hashtag save 100, save 100 million lives in the comments section for me. Let's blow this thing up so we can reach more people with the mission and the greater goal, which is to get people off the drugs and back to living. So help me in my mission, save 100 million lives. come back and visit me next Monday. As always, we'll be here for Pick Dr. Osborne's Brain. And if you're not already subscribed to the channel, hit that subscribe button or come visit me at glutenfreesociety.org. If you're kind of new to all this and you don't know really where to get started, come subscribe to our newsletter over at glutenfreesociety.org. It's the world's largest #1 gluten-free informational newsletter that is science-packed and comes to you once a week. So sign up for that. And as also, if you haven't read No Grain, No Pain, I highly encourage you to go back and start looking at reading that. If you don't have a copy, you can go pick one up at Barnes & Noble or Amazon, or you can get one from your public library and read it for free. But whatever you do, just read it. Get educated. That's what I want to encourage you guys to do, is get educated. Knowledge is power. And once you have the knowledge, you can take action. And once you take action, you can change your life. And that's what it's all about. So we'll see you next week. This is Dr. Osborne wishing you excellent health. Hey, don't forget to tune in next week, same time, 6 p.m. Central Standard Time, for another Pick Dr. Osborne's Brain show. Bring all your toughest health questions to me. I look forward to answering them. And before you leave today, make sure you hit subscribe. And once you do, click that bell. That bell is going to allow us to remind you right before we go live, but it's also going to allow us to remind you when we come out with other video content all week long. We've got lots of episodes coming your way all week long, and I don't want you to miss anything. So again, subscribe, hit that bell so that you can get notified when we have that new information put up for you. Thanks so much, and I'm wishing you excellent health. Have a great week. We'll see you next Monday night.